11 years is a long time to watch something without introducing yourself. The Varani Confederation had been doing exactly that since their long-range sensor network picked up humanity's early faster-than-light test signatures coming from the third planet of the Sol system. The signatures were faint and inconsistent, the specific pattern of a civilization in the early experimental stages of jump technology, producing results that were promising but not yet reliable. The Varani had seen this pattern 6 times before with 6 other species, and they knew what it meant. It meant a civilization was approximately 15 to 20 years from achieving stable jump capability. It meant first contact was coming whether the Varani initiated it or not. It meant the 11-year clock had started. The Varani did not rush first contact assessments. This was not bureaucratic caution. It was the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had been making first contact with developing species for 300 years and had learned through experience that the quality of the relationship that followed was directly proportional to the quality of the preparation that preceded it. You watched. You learned. You built the most complete and accurate picture of the species you were about to meet that your observation capability allowed. Then you made contact from a position of genuine understanding rather than assumption. The assessment team assigned to the Sol system was led by a senior analyst named Envoy Drell, a patient and precise figure with 20 years of first contact experience and a reputation for producing assessments that were thorough to the point of being exhaustive. He assembled a team of 12 specialists covering technology evaluation, cultural analysis, political structure assessment, military capability review, and a half-dozen other analytical domains that a complete species assessment required. They watched for 11 years. The picture they assembled was detailed and careful and built on 11 years of long-range observation data from every available source. Humanity was a mid-tier developing civilization, technologically promising. Their jump capability development was faster than the average of Varani had observed across previous first contact species, and their energy generation and computational systems showed innovation patterns that the technology assessment team flagged as worth monitoring. Politically complex, a multi-nation structure that had been moving toward greater unified governance over the observed period, not without friction but with consistent directional trend. Militarily modest, capable within their home system, developing beyond it, nothing that placed them outside the expected capability range for a species at their developmental stage. The assessment was thorough. It was also wrong in one specific way. The error was not in what the assessment said. It was in what the observation capability could see. 11 years of long-range sensor data from outside the Sol system produced an excellent picture of what humanity was doing on and near its inhabited worlds, and in the inner system, where most of humanity's visible activity was concentrated. It produced a less complete picture of the outer system where the distances were greater and the sensor returns were thinner, and where certain things could exist without being clearly visible to observation assets that were not inside the system looking outward. Drell's assessment team did not know about the gap in their coverage. Their instruments were performing correctly. The data they were analyzing was accurate. The picture it produced was genuine. It was just incomplete in one area that nobody would identify for another 18 months. The first contact vessel arrived at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday morning. It was a standard Varani diplomatic vessel, not military, not armed beyond the minimal defensive systems that Varani protocol required for any vessel operating in unassessed space, broadcasting its peaceful intentions on every frequency that the Varani communication library associated with developing civilizations at humanity's stage. The broadcast was clear and professional and had been prepared over 6 months of careful drafting by the communication team specifically for this moment. Humanity responded in 40 minutes. Drell had expected a longer response time. Previous first contact species had taken anywhere from several hours to several days to produce an organized official response, the delay reflecting the political and organizational process of a civilization that had not necessarily had a prepared response ready and was assembling one in real time. 40 minutes suggested a prepared response. The communication that came back was warm without being effusive, organized without being rigid, and delivered with a quality of calm that Drell had not encountered in his previous first contact experiences. Previous species had responded with excitement, with caution, with formality that barely concealed nervousness. Humanity's response had none of the nervousness. It had the specific, steady quality of people who had been thinking about this conversation for a long time and had arrived at it ready. The diplomat who led the human response introduced herself as Ambassador Carol Hayes. She was precise in her language and unhurried in her manner, and she delivered humanity's formal response to the Varani greeting with the kind of confidence that came from preparation rather than from pretending to be more confident than she was. Drell noted immediately that she was not performing composure. She simply had it. She said humanity was pleased to make contact with the Varani Confederation. She said the human government had prepared for this possibility and was ready to engage in the integration process that the Varani communication had outlined. She said she had been designated as humanity's primary diplomatic contact and was available for whatever the Varani required to begin. She said all of this in the first 4 minutes of the communication. Drell sat with his team in the first contact vessel's communication center and listened to Carol Hayes deliver humanity's prepared response and noted 3 things simultaneously. The first was that the response was genuinely prepared, not assembled in 40 minutes, but ready and waiting for the trigger of the Varani contact to be delivered. The level of organization and the specific language suggested preparation that went back significantly further than 40 minutes. The second was that the diplomat delivering it was extremely good at her job. Drell had sat across from a lot of diplomats in 20 years, and he had a well-developed sense for the difference between competence and exceptional competence. Carol Hayes was the second kind. The third was that humanity seemed unsurprised. Not unsurprised in the sense of hiding surprise. Drell had enough experience to recognize concealed emotional responses, and he was not seeing that. Unsurprised in the genuine sense of a party for whom this contact was an expected event that had arrived on a timeline. They had been anticipating rather than a surprise that required adjustment. He filed a third observation as a cultural note in his preliminary report. Species sometimes developed extensive first contact preparation programs that produced this quality of readiness. It was not uncommon. It did not require deeper analysis at this stage. He would think about it again 18 months later, when Captain Todd Sensor Data arrived at the diplomatic mission, and the cultural note turned out to be the most important observation in 11 years of assessment work. But that was 18 months away. For now, Drell introduced himself to Carol Hayes on the communication channel, and they began the conversation that 11 years of watching had been building toward. It was a good conversation. Professional, substantive, honest on both sides. Drell noted in his report that evening that the first contact had proceeded better than any of his previous 6. He also noted the unsurprised quality again. He looked at the note for a moment. Then he moved on to the next section of the report. He had a lot of work to do. The integration period began the week after first contact and ran on the Varani protocol schedule that Drell had used for 3 previous integrations. The schedule was structured and well-tested. A sequence of sessions, exchanges, and assessment processes that had been refined over 300 years of Varani first contact experience into something that produced reliable results. Cultural exchange first, because understanding how a species thought and communicated was a foundation that everything else was built on. Then trade framework discussions, because economic relationship building created the practical interdependencies that diplomatic relationships needed to be durable. Then the formal membership assessment, which covered the full range of domains that coalition membership required a new species to be evaluated against: governance structure, technological capability, resource base, military posture, and a half-dozen other areas that the assessment framework addressed. 18 months. Structured, sequenced, thorough. Humanity engaged with every part of it. Carol Hayes organized the human delegation's participation with the same prepared efficiency she had brought to the first contact communication. She had a team of specialists behind her, cultural liaisons, trade experts, technical advisors, the full complement of people that serious engagement with a comprehensive integration process required, and she deployed them with the organized clarity of someone who had been planning this for a long time and was now executing the plan. Drell noticed this in the first week and noted it in his session report. The human delegation was not assembling its approach as the process developed. It had arrived with an approach already assembled, positions prepared, documentation ready, questions formulated in advance. not in the rigid way of a delegation that had scripted everything and was following a script, but in the flexible and informed way of people who had done extensive preparation and were using that preparation to engage genuinely rather than reactively. He had seen thorough preparation before. He had not often seen preparation at this level. The cultural exchange sessions ran for the first 3 months. They were the most open and informal part of the integration process, designed to be exploratory rather than evaluative, to give both parties a space to understand each other as civilizations before the more formal assessment work began. Drell had conducted cultural exchanges with 3 previous species, and they had ranged from illuminating to difficult depending on how compatible the 2 civilizations' fundamental orientations were. The sessions with humanity were illuminating, not because everything was easy or compatible. Some of the discussions were genuinely complex, covering areas where human history and Varani institutional experience saw things differently and where the honest exploration of those differences required care and patience. But Carol Hayes brought honesty to the complex discussions the same way she brought it to everything else. She did not soften the areas where humanity's history was complicated or where human perspectives diverged from Varani norms. She explained them directly and let the explanation stand. Drell developed respect for this across the 3 months. Honest engagement with difficult material was rarer than it should have been in diplomatic work, and he recognized it when he saw it. The trade framework discussions ran through months 4 to 8. This was where most integration processes slowed down. Trade frameworks required detailed negotiation of terms that affected real economic interests, and negotiation was often the most friction-intensive part of the 18 months. The human delegation engaged with the trade framework work with the same thorough preparation they brought to everything, and Carol's trade specialists knew the subject matter in the specific way of people who had studied it deeply rather than people who had been briefed on it recently. The framework came together faster than Drell's previous integrations. Not because humanity gave ground easily. They negotiated with a specific confidence of people who knew the value of what they were offering and expected fair terms, but because their preparation meant the discussions move at the pace of genuine negotiation rather than the slower pace of negotiation, where one party is learning the subject while negotiating it. By month 8, the trade framework was substantially complete, and the formal membership assessment had begun. The assessment was the most structured part of the 18 months, a formal evaluation process with specific documentation requirements, defined review criteria, and a sequential structure that moved through each assessment domain in order. The Varani assessment team conducted it with the thoroughness that Drell's team brought to everything. The governance assessment went smoothly. Humanity's political structure was complex but well documented, and Carol's delegation had prepared the governance documentation with the completeness that the review criteria required. The technological assessment produced the most interesting sessions of the formal process. The Varani Technology Evaluation Team was sophisticated, and their review of humanities submitted documentation generated substantive technical discussions that went beyond the standard assessment questions into genuine exchange about how human and Varani technological development had followed different paths to similar capabilities. Carol's technical advisors engaged with these discussions with a depth of knowledge that the Varani technology team found genuinely engaging. The lead Varani technology evaluator, a precise specialist named Analyst Venn, filed a note in his assessment report saying the human technical delegation was the most technically capable he had assessed in 4 integration processes. He recommended continued monitoring of human technological development as a priority item. The note was filed. It was accurate. It was about the technical capability that the documentation had disclosed. It did not account for what the documentation had not disclosed because the documentation requirement asked for what existed and the documentation submitted was technically accurate. This distinction would matter later. The military capability review came in month 14. It was one of the standard assessment domains, not the most prominent in the framework, not the area that generated the most discussion in most integrations. Most developing civilizations at humanity's stage had military capability that was modest and developing and that fit comfortably within the expected range. The review existed to document the baseline and establish the framework for how the new members' military posture would fit into coalition collective security arrangements. Humanity submitted the military documentation in the standard format within the standard deadline. The documentation was specific and organized and covered the required domains, vessel classifications, weapon systems, defensive infrastructure, operational doctrine. The Varani Military Assessment Team reviewed it against the 11 years of observation data and against a general framework for civilizations at humanity's developmental stage. The review found the documentation consistent with observed data, modest capability, developing infrastructure, inter-system defensive posture, nothing that fell outside the expected range. The assessment team lead signed off on the military review and forwarded it to the integrated assessment file. Carol Hayes was present at the session where the military review was confirmed as complete. She sat at the table with her delegation and answered the assessment team's questions about the documentation with the same direct and complete honesty she brought to every session. Every question she was asked, she answered accurately. Drell watched her across the table during the military review session with the analytical attention he brought to everything, and noticed what he always noticed about Carol Hayes: the steady quality, the preparation, the honesty that was not performed but simply present. He also noticed something he had noticed before and had filed as a cultural observation: the specific quality of someone who is answering every question asked without volunteering information beyond what is asked. This was normal diplomatic practice. You answered what was asked. You did not provide information beyond the scope of the question. Every delegation and every integration process Drell had conducted operated this way. He filed the observation and moved on. Month 16, month 17. The integrated assessment was nearing completion. The picture the 18 months had produced was thorough and positive. Humanity was a well-prepared, honest, and capable civilization that was ready for coalition membership, and that the Varani assessment process had documented comprehensively. Drell wrote in his Month 17 report that the humanity integration had been the smoothest of his 4 first contact processes. He noted Carol Hayes specifically as an exceptional diplomatic counterpart. He said the relationship built across 18 months was a strong foundation for formal membership that the final month's work would produce. The report was accurate. Month 18 began. On a Wednesday afternoon, a survey vessel in the outer Sol system triggered a proximity alert at coordinates the charts showed as empty. The charts were wrong. And 18 months of careful, thorough, honest integration work was about to add one more chapter that nobody on the Varani side had seen coming. The survey mission had been running for 3 weeks without anything worth noting. This was normal. Outer system navigational mapping was methodical and unglamorous work, the kind of assignment that produced accurate charts and very little else. Survey Captain Todd had been doing this kind of work for 9 years across a dozen different systems, and he had a well-developed tolerance for the specific routine of it. You moved through the assigned coordinates in sequence. You ran your sensor sweeps. You logged the returns. You moved to the next coordinates. The work was important in the way that foundational infrastructure work was important, and it was not exciting in any other way. The Wednesday afternoon shift was 2 hours old when the proximity alert triggered. Todd was at his main console, reviewing the morning's mapping data, when the alert came through. The specific tone that the automated proximity system used when its sensors detected something at a set of coordinates that the navigational charts recorded as empty space. Not an emergency tone, not a weapon alarm or a collision warning. The routine alert that said the charts and the sensors disagreed about what was at a specific location, and a human being needed to look at the disagreement and determine which one was right. Todd had heard this alert hundreds of times in 9 years. His standard response was to check the instrument first. 9 times out of 10, the alert was a sensor calibration issue, a momentary drift in the detection parameters that produced a false return and that resolved itself when you ran the diagnostic sequence and confirmed the instrument was operating within tolerance. The 10th time, it was usually a debris field or an unmapped gravitational anomaly that the charts hadn't caught because outer system mapping was ongoing work, and the charts were always slightly behind the reality of what was actually out there. He ran the diagnostic. The instrument was fine. Calibration within normal parameters. No drift. The sensor was working correctly. He checked the coordinates. The alert had triggered at a specific set of coordinates in the outer Sol system, a region of the mapping assignment that the charts showed as empty space with no significant objects, no debris concentrations, no gravitational features of note. Standard, empty outer system space of the kind that made up most of the assignment area. He pulled up the full sensor return from the alert coordinates. The return populated on his display. Todd looked at it. He was a methodical person by nature and by 9 years of professional habit, and his standard response to unexpected sensor data was to process it carefully and completely before he reacted to it. He had found over 9 years that careful processing almost always produced a straightforward explanation, and that reacting before processing almost always produced unnecessary alarm. He processed a return carefully. He looked at the size data first. The return was showing a solid contact, not a debris field, not a diffuse gravitational feature. A solid contact with defined edges and a specific dimensional profile. He looked at the dimensional numbers and ran them against his experience of what solid contacts at these coordinates typically look like. His experience did not produce a match. He looked at the material composition return. The sensor was giving him readings consistent with refined metals and composite materials, the specific signatures of constructed objects rather than natural formations. Not rock, not ice, not the various natural materials that made up the debris and minor bodies common in outer system regions. Constructed materials. He looked at the energy signature data. There was a low-level power reading associated with the contact. Faint, well below active operational levels, but present and consistent. The specific signature of systems in a maintained standby state, rather than systems that were powered down completely. Todd sat at his console with a full sensor return on his display and looked at all of it together. The contact was large. It was constructed. It had power. He looked at the coordinates again to make absolutely certain he had the right location. He did. He cross-referenced the coordinates against the navigational charts 3 times. The chart showed empty space at those coordinates. The sensor showed what the sensor showed. He sat with this for a few minutes. He thought about the 9 years of outer system mapping work and the hundreds of proximity alerts he had processed and the range of things those alerts had turned out to be. He ran through that range in his head, looking for something that fit what his display was showing him. Nothing fit. He pulled up the dimensional data again and looked at it more carefully. Size, configuration, the specific proportions of what the sensor return was describing. He had a classification framework for most things he encountered in outer system mapping work. The framework was comprehensive, built from 9 years of experience and the accumulated documentation of the Varani Survey Corps' extensive mapping history. It covered natural formations of every type, debris configurations of every variety, and constructed objects across the range of what the Varani and their coalition partners had built and operated in the systems they had mapped. The contact at these coordinates did not fit the classification framework, not because it was outside the size range. The framework covered a wide range, not because the material composition was unusual. Refined metals and composites were well represented in the framework, because the specific combination of size and configuration and the particular proportions the sensor return was describing produced a profile that his framework had a category for, but that he had never actually encountered in 9 years of survey work, because the category was theoretical rather than operational. His framework called the category a Dreadnought class vessel. Todd looked at the category description in his classification reference. He looked at his sensor return. He looked at the category description again. He sat at his console for a while. Then he thought about the 18 months of diplomatic integration that had been running between the Varani mission and the human government. He thought about Ambassador Carol Hayes and the careful and organized diplomatic process that had been producing positive results for a year and a half. He thought about the military capability review that had been completed 2 months ago and filed as consistent with observed data. He thought about the coordinates on his display and what the chart said was at those coordinates. He made a decision about what to do, and it was not the decision to immediately file a formal report, because a formal report required him to describe what he was looking at, and he was not confident he could describe it accurately without more information, and he did not want to write a report that described something incorrectly and then have the incorrect description become the basis of whatever happened next. He sent a communication to the Varani diplomatic mission instead. It was addressed to the mission's senior technical staff. He kept it brief because brevity was appropriate when you were asking someone to look at something rather than explaining something. He said he had a sensor return at specific coordinates that he needed qualified eyes on. He said the return was not matching his classification framework in a way he was comfortable resolving independently. He said he wanted someone to look at the data and tell him what they were seeing before he wrote anything in a report. He attached the full sensor return to the communication. Then he added one more line at the end of the message. He said he wanted to make sure he was not writing a report that made him look like he had lost his mind. He sent it. Then he sat at his console and looked at his display and waited. The survey vessel systems were still running their standard mapping protocols in the background, the automated processes continuing the assignment work, while Todd sat with his proximity alert and thought about Dreadnought class classification categories and the gap between what the navigational chart showed at those coordinates and what his sensor was telling him was actually there. The outer Sol system was quiet around him. The contact at the alert coordinates was not doing anything. It was just there, large and constructed and quietly powered, at a location that the Varani charts had been recording as empty space for 11 years. Todd looked at the coordinates on his display. He thought about 11 years. He thought about what 11 years of something being at a specific location implied about how long it had been there, and about what it meant that the charts had been wrong about those coordinates for that entire period. He sat with these thoughts while he waited for the diplomatic mission to respond. His coffee went cold. He didn't notice. Drell received the sensor data at 1640 on a Wednesday afternoon. His technical advisor brought it to him directly, not routed through the standard communication queue, but hand-delivered with the specific manner of someone who had looked at the attached data before delivering it and had decided that the person receiving it should have it immediately rather than when the queue got to it. Drell thanked him and opened the data. He was a methodical reader. He processed the sensor return the way he processed everything, completely, in order, without jumping to conclusion before he had read everything that preceded it. Size data first, then material composition, then energy signatures, then the full dimensional profile that Todd's sensors had assembled from the return. He read through it once. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again. He sat at his desk for a while after the second reading. His technical advisor was still in the room. Drell asked him to pull up the Varani classification framework for the dimensional profile the sensor return was describing and cross-reference it against the contact parameters. His advisor did this and brought the result back in 10 minutes and placed it on Drell's desk without saying anything because the result did not require commentary. Drell looked at the cross-reference. The framework produced one classification match. He looked at the classification for a moment. Then he looked at the coordinates Todd had flagged. Then he looked at the 11 years of observation data that his assessment team had produced on the Sol system, the same data that had been the foundation of the assessment that described humanity's military capability as modest and developing and consistent with expected ranges. He thought about the outer system coverage gap that his observation assets had been operating with for 11 years without anyone specifically identify it as a gap, because you did not look for gaps in coverage of areas that your charts showed as empty. The charts had been wrong. He picked up the communication terminal and contacted Ambassador Carol Hayes on the diplomatic channel. He told her he had something that required an honest conversation and asked if she was available. He kept it brief. He did not describe the sensor data in the communication because the description belonged in the conversation rather than in a preliminary message. Carol's response came back in under 5 minutes. She said she would come to him. She arrived at the Varani diplomatic mission 40 minutes later. Drell met her at the entrance himself rather than having his staff bring her to the session room, because meeting her at the entrance was the acknowledgement that this was not a routine session, and he thought that acknowledgement should be visible rather than implied. Carol noted it. She noted everything. She came with 2 members of her senior staff, and she had the specific qualities she always had: composed, prepared, present. They walked to the session room together. It was the same room where they had conducted 18 months of integration work. The same table, the same chairs, the same arrangement they had settled into in the first week and used for every session since. Drell sat across from Carol and her staff and put the sensor data on the table between them. He said, "Survey Captain Todd sent this from the outer Sol system this afternoon. He asked me to look at it because he did not have the classification framework to describe it accurately. He said, 'I have the classification framework. I would like you to tell me if it applies.'" Carol looked at the sensor data on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Drell directly. She said, "Yes, it applies." The room was quiet for a moment. Carol sat with the quiet for exactly as long as it needed to last, and then she said she was going to tell him everything, and she would like him to let her finish before he responded, because the complete picture was important and the pieces of it needed to be heard together rather than individually. Drell said, "Please." She told him. What Todd's survey vessel had found was real. It was not a debris field, not a natural formation, not a sensor anomaly. It was exactly what the classification framework said it was. She confirmed the classification without hesitation, and without the diplomatic softening that difficult confirmations sometimes received. It was one of 7. Drell had suspected this from the moment he cross-referenced the classification framework. A single installation at one outer system coordinate was possible as an isolated project. 7 installations at specific points throughout and beyond the Sol system was a program. Something planned and executed over a significant period with a specific strategic logic. Carol explained the strategic logic. She said humanity had been watching the developing galactic community for a long time before the Varani made contact. Not with hostility, with the specific attention of a civilization that understood it was about to enter a larger world and was thinking carefully about what entering that world safely required. The galactic community that humanity had been watching had powers and hierarchies and histories that humanity was not part of and did not fully understand. Some of what humanity had observed was reassuring. Some of it was not. The complete picture was complicated enough that humanity had made a decision, a deliberate and considered decision at the governmental level, about what genuine preparedness meant for a civilization in humanity's position. The decision had been made 200 years ago. That was when the isolation period had begun, not because humanity was afraid of the galactic community or because the first contact failure had broken humanity's confidence. Because building what humanity had decided to build required time and resources and focus that were easier to sustain without the complications of active galactic engagement. The isolation was chosen. It was a strategic decision with a strategic purpose, and the purpose was to emerge in the isolation period as something different from what humanity had been when the isolation began. 7 installations, positioned at the specific points that a careful strategic assessment of Sol system defense and beyond system deterrence required. Built over 200 years of sustained and focused effort by people who understood what they were building and why they were building it. Carol said they were not aimed at anyone. She said this clearly and specifically, not as a reassurance designed to soften what she was telling him, but as a factual statement about the installation's operational posture. Defensive orientation. No active targeting of any current party. Built to ensure that certain things could not happen to humanity, rather than to enable humanity to do certain things to others. She said the disclosure had always been planned. The formal membership process had a section specifically designed for this disclosure, the part of the process where humanity would present the complete picture of its actual defensive capability, rather than the picture that the standard military capability documentation covered. The documentation submitted to the military capability review had been accurate within the scope of what that review asked for. The review had not asked for information about installations in the outer system, because the review framework did not have a category for what the outer system contained, and therefore had not asked the question. Humanity had answered what was asked. The survey vessel had found what wasn't asked about. Carol said she was sorry the timeline had moved this way, not sorry that the disclosure was happening. The disclosure was always going to happen. Sorry that it had come to survey vessel proximity alert rather than through the formal process she had prepared for, because the formal process had been designed to present the information in its full context rather than as a surprise finding. She said, "We wanted you to understand it completely when you found out. The survey vessel found it before we could provide that context. I am providing it now." She finished and sat back slightly and looked at Drell across the table. The room was quiet. Drell sat with everything Carol had told him. He was a methodical processor, and there was a significant amount of process. Not because any individual piece was unclear. Carol had been precise and complete, but because the full picture assembled from the pieces was large and required the specific time that large things require before you could hold them properly. He thought about 11 years of observation work, about the assessment that had described humanity's military capability as modest and developing. About 18 months of integration sessions with a diplomat who had answered every question honestly and completely and had never said anything that was untrue. He thought about the difference between answering what was asked and disclosing what wasn't asked about. He thought about 200 years of quiet and deliberate preparation behind the diplomatic composure that had been sitting across from him in this room for 18 months. He looked at Carol Hayes. She met his look with the same steady and direct quality she had brought to every session since the first contact communication. Not defensive, not anxious about what he was going to say. Present and honest and waiting. Drell said he had one question. Carol said, "Ask it." Drell asked the question. He said, "Why didn't you just use what you built to take the position you wanted? You have had the capability for a long time. The diplomatic process takes time and produces uncertainty and requires things from you that simply having the capability does not require. Why go through it?" He asked it the way he asked everything, directly, without judgment in the framing, as a genuine request for information rather than a challenge. Carol looked at him across the table. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone assembling a diplomatic answer. The quiet of someone who had a real answer and was making sure she said it correctly because the correct version of it mattered. She said, "Because we didn't build it to take anything." She said, "We built it so nobody could take anything from us. That is a different thing. The difference matters to us." She let it sit for a moment, and then she said, "A civilization that uses its capability to take what it wants is a specific kind of civilization. We looked at the history of what that kind of civilization produces, for itself and for everyone around it, and we decided we didn't want to be that. We wanted to be in the galactic community because the galactic community was worth being part of, and we wanted to join it on terms that said something true about what we were, not on terms that said we had the capability to demand entry and had demanded it." She said, "We could have walked in and announced ourselves and made clear what the alternative was. We chose not to. The choice was deliberate. It was not weakness, and it was not fear. It was who we decided to be." Drell sat with this for a long time. Then he said he understood. He said it simply, and he meant it simply, not as a diplomatic response, not as a transitional phrase, as a genuine conclusion of a methodical person who had processed what he had been told and had arrived at understanding. Carol nodded. They sat in the session room for a few more minutes, handling the immediate practical matters, what the disclosure meant for the membership process timeline, how the information would be formally entered into the integration record, what the communication protocol would be for the Varani mission's report to the Confederation. Carol's staff and Drell's staff handled most of the practical detail, and Carol and Drell sat at the table while their teams worked and did not say much more to each other, but sat in the specific, comfortable quiet of two people who had just had an honest conversation about something significant and did not need to fill the quiet with anything additional. Carol and her delegation left the mission at 2100. Drell sat at his desk for 3 hours after they left and wrote the most significant report of his career. He was a thorough writer, and the thoroughness served him here because the report needed to be complete and accurate and organized in a way that gave the Varani Confederation the full picture rather than a summary. He wrote everything. The survey vessel alert, the censored data, his conversation with Carol, the disclosure in full, and his own assessment of what it meant for the integration process and for the Confederation's relationship with humanity going forward. He spent an hour on the assessment section because the assessment required honesty about what the 11 years of observation work had, and had not produced an honesty about what 18 months of integration sessions had, and had not captured. The assessment team had done good work. The observation work had been conducted correctly. The gaps in the picture were not failures of competence. They were the product of looking at something, and not seeing what you were not looking for. He wrote that clearly. He wrote that the military capability documentation humanity had submitted was accurate within the scope of what had been asked. He wrote that the scope of what had been asked had been determined by an assessment framework built around what the Varani had encountered in previous first contact processes, and that humanity had not fit that framework in one specific and significant way. He wrote his recommendation. He said the integration process should continue. He said the revised picture of humanity's actual capability and developmental status required a revised membership framework. one that reflected what humanity was rather than the developing civilization profile the standard framework had been built around. He said humanity had engaged honestly across 18 months and had disclosed fully when the timeline required it, and had explained the context of what they disclosed with the direct honesty that had characterized every interaction. He said the question of whether humanity was trustworthy had been answered by how they had handled the disclosure. He filed a report at 0140 Thursday morning. The Varani Confederation's response came back 3 weeks later. Drell read it at his desk on a Tuesday morning with coffee and the specific attention of someone who had been waiting for a response for 3 weeks and who understood that the response was going to determine the shape of the next significant period of work. It was not a withdrawal. He had not expected a withdrawal, but the confirmation was still meaningful. It was not a demand, not a formal requirement for additional disclosure, not a suspension of the process pending further investigation, not any of the defensive institutional responses that a discovery of this nature might have generated from an organization more focused on managing its own position than on responding to the actual situation. It was a revised membership offer. The revisions were substantive. The membership framework that the offer described was built around what the Confederation's senior council had determined humanity actually was, which was not a developing civilization on its way to significance, but a civilization that had arrived at significance through a deliberate and sustained process and was now ready to participate in the galactic community as what it had become. The terms were different from the standard membership terms, not worse. Different in the way that appropriate terms were different from standard terms when the standard terms had been built for a different kind of party than the party being offered them. Drell sent a communication to Carol Hayes that said the Confederation's response had arrived and asked her to come to the mission at her convenience. She arrived that afternoon. He placed the offer on the table between them, and she read it completely before she said anything. He watched her read it with the analytical attention he had been giving her for 18 months and noted what he always noted: the focused and complete quality of how she engaged with material, the absence of performance in her expression, the specific moment when she had read enough to understand the full picture, and the brief still quality that followed that moment before she moved on to the next page. She finished reading. She looked at Drell. She said, "This is a serious offer." He said, "It is a correct offer. It reflects what you are rather than what we initially assess you to be." The council determined that accuracy was more important than the comfort of standard frameworks. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would need to present it to her government and would have a response within the week. The formal disclosure to the broader galactic community began 6 weeks later. It moved through the standard diplomatic channels that significant information moved through: the Coalition's member communication network, the formal notification protocols that kept member and observer civilizations current on developments affecting the community's collective situation. The disclosure was complete and well documented and presented in the organized way that Carol's team prepared everything. The reactions came in over the following weeks and months. Some civilizations requested emergency sessions. The sessions were granted and attended and conducted with the careful professionalism that significant diplomatic moments required. Carol or her designated representatives attended each one and answered every question with the same direct honesty that had characterized everything from the first contact communication onward. Some civilizations filed formal inquiries through the Coalition's official process. The inquiries were answered completely. A few went quiet, not in an alarmed way, in the specific way of parties who have been operating from a model of the situation and had received information that required the model to be rebuilt from different foundations, and who needed time to do that rebuilding before they had anything useful to say. Drell recognized this quality because he had been in it himself for the 3 weeks between filing his report and receiving the Confederation's response. The quiet ones came back eventually with better questions than the ones who had responded immediately. The Varani Senior Council held a formal session on the disclosure and its implications. The session was recorded in the standard way, and the record entered the Confederation's institutional archive, and through the archive into broader historical record of the period. The council chair was a senior figure named Director in Cole, who had been in the role for 8 years, and who had the specific quality of someone who had processed significant information over a long career, and had developed the ability to say clearly what the information meant without dressing it in more language than it required. She said, "For 11 years we believed we were assessing a developing civilization. We were not. We were being assessed by one that had already developed and was deciding whether we were worth joining. She said they decided we were. She said that says more about them than anything in our 11 years of observation did. The statement was recorded and archived and quoted in every account of the period that followed because it was accurate and because it said in 3 sentences what longer analyses said in many more words without saying it as well. Drell read the council session record in his office the day after it was filed. He read the council chair's statement twice. Then he thought about Carol Hayes sitting across from him in the session room on a Wednesday evening telling him that the difference between building capability to take things and building capability to prevent things from being taken was a real difference and that it mattered. He thought about 18 months of honest engagement from a civilization that had been sitting on the most significant undisclosed capability in the known galactic community and had handled the disclosure of it by coming to his office in person and telling him the truth directly and answering his one question with 2 sentences that said everything that needed to be said. He thought the council chair was right. It said more about them than anything else did. He filed his own note in the integration record. It was brief. It said that the humanity integration had been the most significant first contact process in the Varani Confederation's 300 years of first contact experience, and that the significance lay not in the capability disclosure, but in how the disclosure had been handled. He said they could have handled it differently. They chose not to. The choice tells you what you need to know. He filed the note and closed the record. Then he sent a communication to Carol Hayes asking if she was available for coffee because they had work to do on the revised membership implementation, and he had found across 18 months that work done over coffee with Carol Hayes went better than work done any other way. She responded in 10 minutes. She said she would be there at 0900. He was not surprised. He had stopped being surprised by Carol Hayes being prepared and present, and exactly where she said she would be approximately 16 months ago. Some things you just learn to expect.